So what is an origami tessellation? How is that different from a tessellation in math? And how is it different from other kinds of origami? That's the question we're going to go over today. Hi, I'm Madonna. Welcome to Gathering Folds. And in this live stream, we're going to talk about exactly that. What is a tessellation? Hint, it's each of these pieces in front of me. How are they made? And what are some of the leading tessellation artists doing, and how can we tell their distinctive styles apart? So first up, let's address the math. So in math, a tessellation is a repeating geometric, or sorry, not even necessarily geometric. A tessellation is a repeating pattern that can repeat infinitely. And typically we're talking about tessellations in 2 dimensions, so we're talking about flat surfaces. Now this is really convenient for origami because our paper already starts as a flat surface. And so it's relatively easier to create flat surfaces from a flat surface than volumetric surfaces or volumes. And although there are repeating patterns in origami that do make volumes as well. But tessellations specifically in origami are geometric repeating patterns folded from a single sheet of paper. So that's the first thing that most people ask me when I show them a tessellation. They say, oh, is that multiple pieces of paper put together? And no, it's actually a single sheet. So when I fold a tessellation, I start out with just a flat sheet of paper with nothing on it, and sometimes I cut it into a hexagon, sometimes I cut it into a square. Sometimes I use a rectangle as well. And then I put a background grid onto this paper. Sometimes I put the background grid that has grid lines on the edges of the paper. Sometimes I do a background grid where the edge of the paper is not a grid line. You can see there's a difference between the angles there. And once I have the grid on my paper, I then fold my tessellation from the grid. Now this isn't the same process for all origami tessellation folders. It's the process that I mostly use, and I've been able to create a wide variety of tessellations with that process. So as we look at some of the origami artists that are doing some of the most innovative work, mostly the people that have books and a few more with distinctive styles, I'm going to be pointing out in these tessellations of my design here which ones more closely match what these other designers are doing. So let's start with Alessandra Bear, and I'll switch my screen over. So Alessandro has a book out, as I said, and he likes to focus on inspiration from Islamic patterns. And another thing that he does because of that is a lot of switching back and forth between different twist types. So this is kind of a prototypical example of Alessandro's designs, where he has a hexagon going into squares, which then go into triangles. So typically you only have either hexagons and triangles or squares in the same pattern. This pattern right here is most similar to one of Alessandro's designs. I actually thought it was the same as his when I came up with it, and then saw that he had posted pretty much the same thing. And what makes this different from most of my other designs is I needed to pre-crease it before I collapsed. So after I folded the grid, I then had another step of pre-creasing before I could collapse the pattern. And that's something I tend to avoid in my patterns, but with Alessandro's emphasis on going between different grid systems, it's almost unavoidable. So next up, let's take a look over at Elon Gorey's work. So Elon does a lot of pieces that are mostly described as corrugations. So the distinction between a corrugation and an origami tessellation in general is that in corrugations you can pretty much see all of the surface of the paper. So when we look at, say, this pattern, we can see that these bricks are laying down and we can see into the spaces in between. Another way of saying it is, if I were to spray paint this, I could cover the whole surface. And so Elon's pieces tend to follow that rule. Like you can see these two pendants, or the pendant on the right and the tessellation on the left do follow that. Those are both done in metal. But he also has other patterns like this one that do not follow that rule. There's paper trapped under these windmill points that does not see the light of day. And so this would, technically speaking, not be a corrugation, even though most of Elon's pieces are. Corrugations, like Alessandra's work going between different systems, are commonly pre-creased and then collapsed all at once at the end. My piece that's most similar to Elon's is this half-adjacent squares piece. And this was partly inspired by some of Elon's work. And this one I can make 3D if I choose to. And so it looks a lot like, I think it's Elon's Cubes series. And so I can have these vertical bits, and on the other side you can see these are starting to puff up these central pieces and make these elevated areas and sunken in areas, like we can see in several of Elon's pieces. So next up, I want to show you some work from Peter Keller. Let me just flatten this back. So this, I should also mention, this one was a gradual collapse process, but only because I folded all of the grid lines that cover the creases necessary. If I had only folded some of the grid lines and needed to put in the diagonals, I would have needed to pre-crease the whole thing first and then collapse later. So that's that piece out of the way. And we also did second piece also out of the way. So now looking at Peter Keller's work, his focus is largely on flagstone tilings. So these flagstone tilings are when you have twists that come next to each other to cover the whole surface of the paper. So like you can see in these just rhombi tiling pieces, he has a whole bunch of twists in the paper that are coming together and covering the surface and creating a smooth surface of only twists. And while I don't have a flagstone here in front of me, that was another inspiration of my semi-adjacent series. So this half-adjacent squares, if I had them all the way adjacent. So if this edge matched up with this edge exactly, instead of being half off, then it would be a flagstone tiling. Another thing that Peter commonly uses are these isoarea hexagon twists. And those are also present in my rosebud tessellation. So these twists are the same front and back when they're flattened, but you can also open them out into these bud structures, as you can see in these three tessellations. This is a feature that Peter Keller shares with the next artist, Joel Cooper, who uses these kinds of twists in elaborate mask structures. So these masks are not themselves tessellations, but they do use tessellation techniques. So tessellation techniques include pleat overlaps, twists, bringing pleats together into intersections where you can then flatten them. You can have all kinds of this wrinkly stuff going on with the beard as well. And you can be really flexible with your use of these elements, either to create tessellations themselves or to create other items with these tessellation techniques. Our next person up, our next tessellation artist is Ben Parker. Ben has a book out on twists, 6 simple twists, and these days he mostly does corrugations. And he's been doing a lot of free-flowing folding, where he'll start a pattern and then improvise the next steps. So that's something you can do more easily with corrugations, where he's putting in some starting lines and then reflecting folds off of those starting lines, than you can with grid-based tessellations. Although once you know some generator functions for tessellations, you can more or less start folding and then figure out what you want to do, at least with practice pieces. So a big distinction with the way that Ben works and the way that I work is I like to plan everything out. You can see that I have different kinds of borders on my tessellations. So on this one, the pleats go perpendicular to the edge. On this one, I've got my grid parallel to the edge. And on this one, I'm somewhere in between. And these are all choices that were calculated in advance by me before I started folding, so I would end up with a result that I felt was most pleasing. So there's a whole variety of ways to apply tessellation techniques, and no one way is superior to any other. It's all artistic decisions once you get into it. So next up, Ericjordy. You might be familiar with Eric because he has the most popular book for beginners on origami tessellations. He also has some corrugations in here, similar to Ben Parker, going from twist-based to corrugation style of tessellations. And he also has some more Elon Gorey, we're going to see upcoming soon, Tom Crane-esque corrugations that are potentially even rigidly foldable. And I'll get into a bit of what rigidly foldable means as well. In general, with tessellations, twists in general are not rigidly foldable unless there are certain conditions that are met. For example, the closed square twist can be rigidly folded if you add one diagonal crease in the middle. But that's not so practical for folding repeated twists. So next up, we have another tessellation artist, Miguel Giann, and he's been specializing recently in stacked twists. So I have a version of a similar style. I call these compound twists, where I have one twist on one side and a next twist at the same location, a tube pleat spacing out. And don't worry if you don't understand what I mean by tube pleat, but check out my my series on how to start with tessellations, where I explain all of these terms that I'm using. And so with Miguel's work, he's getting a lot of really interesting new designs. He came out with a book recently, and if I remember correctly, I heard he's working on another one. And a lot of these designs include interesting variations on twists that are commonly used, or ways to stack twists on top of each other and create new styles of designs. Next up we have Katarina Lucasheva. She does curved crease tessellations. So she and Winnie Long are some of the foremost practitioners of curved crease tessellations, and you can see she has a wide variety of geometries that she uses. Here we've got a hexagon and triangle based geometry, here a square geometry, and including some geometries that are less tessellatable, that might have really high numbers of pleats going into a particular twisty structure. And she's done work with corrugations as well, with spirals. And a spiral, I would say, is not strictly a tessellation because it doesn't repeat in space. But as you can see, you can connect spirals into repeating patterns that do form tessellations. So I don't have an example of curved crease folding in front of me, but it's one of the fantastic things that you can see. And she also has several books out. So next up are Cinny Coomb. He's been doing a lot of really interesting work that does require pre-creasing to fold. So the distinction being fully twist-based, like most of my pieces, or pre-crease and then collapse later. Generally, with pre-crease and collapse stuff, unless it is a corrugation, you are going to have twists in there. And he tends to use some unusual shapes and unusual arrangements of shapes. So here you can see some very large rhombi. You can see different sizes of right triangles and squares. You can see just some of these large parallelograms, some rectangles that you don't typically see, and trapezoids and these kite shapes that are pretty interesting, and just a wide variety of different shapes, I would say, is Arseny's specialty. He also does some fractals, you can see, and in general, he has just this huge variety of designs. They tend to be somewhat more abstract looking and harder to figure out than a lot of my designs. And so when you see this kind of style, I tend to be like, okay, that's Cinny Coomb. And I do recommend going onto Instagram, onto Flickr, checking out these people so you can see more of their photos and get a better sense of what their styles are. So 3 people left. Next up is Remy. So he's done some strictly tessellation pieces, but mostly he does fractals. And a lot of his fractals involve curved creases. So why do I say that this is not a tessellation? I mean, it has repeats, doesn't it? But these repeats are not at the same size. These repeats do not go on infinitely. And so it would be qualified more as a fractal than as a tessellation. And so being able to pick out, like, okay, is this repeating at the same size or not? Does this have rings that have a certain size step between the rings? And then there are, of course, some tessellations as well. Here's some more examples of the flagstone style of tessellations, where you have the surface covered by distinct blocks that all touch each other. And then back to the idea of rigid folding. So Tom Crane often will fold with wood laminate instead of paper. And so there you have different constraints. The panels themselves cannot bend. And so you're limited in what you can do. But there's a lot of math that's been worked out on these rigidly folding structures, and you can get many of them, whether you have a rigidly folding surface or a paper surface. And then I'm also seeing a lot of weave structures here. So distinguishing between the materials is another skill when you're looking at tessellation type things. Here we have a wood laminate. This one looks like either paper or fabric. And this one's definitely paper. You can see the crease lines in the background. The exteriors of these boxes are paper, folded with twist-based methods. And you can get a wide variety of designs. So what's here on his Instagram is a small subset of what he's made. There's probably more on Flickr. And another subcategory of tessellations is the math-driven designs. So Helena Verrill is an excellent example of these math-driven designs. She often has parameterized sliders that you can play with on her website of how to make new variants of a parameter space that will create a new design. And she's another excellent person to follow, and always has interesting projects. I did some work. I met up with her, I think, at the conference at MoMath, MOVES conference, Mathematics of Various Entertaining Subjects, where we were talking about herringbone patterns, and I figured out how to do it in fabric, and then that led me to figuring out how to do it in paper. But she's done lots of work on different design systems and has many different tessellations that she has designed and folded. So with that said, I'll bring you over to my own Instagram, where I talk about a different tessellation every week, and I make sure to explain some of the math and the choices that I've made behind these tessellations, and also give some hints of, for example, some tessellations to fold before you fold any particular one that I'm showing. So I'll have these sequences of tessellations with the skills that you need to fold each one. I also tutor origami tessellations, and I have various courses on the basic twists, on the tilings that I use for tessellations, and be sure to check out my What's a Tiling and How is it Used video as well, if you're curious about tilings. And there's just a lot of stuff on here. So when I look at all of these different origami artists, I see the different styles that we each have. And my specialty is really in finding different arrangements of twists and taking full advantage of that. So even right here on my table, I have examples of different kinds of arrangements of twists. So here I have a square tiling. So I've got all squares in here, but I have no positions of fourfold rotational symmetry, which you would expect with squares. Like, if you have a square, it's probably going to be the same if you rotate it 4 times at 90-degree angles. But this one is only the same 2 ways around. So I'm taking this corner, bringing it up to the top corner. You see these pairs of squares are still in the same alignment. And then I can flip over to the back side, and you can see it's exactly the same pattern on the back. So that's something that's really cool to me, is having the same pattern on the front and the back of my paper. And I do that with many of my designs. The rest of these here are different front and back. And one of the things that I've been exploring lately is how changing small things about a tessellation can get you completely different results. So let's take these two as an example. In the design of these two tessellations, there is one choice that is different. And that one choice is which side of the paper to put the open triangle. So in this tessellation, I kept the open triangle twist on the same side as the closed hexagon. And in this tessellation, I put that same open triangle, same dense spacing on the back. And this generates two completely different designs. So like Helena, I'm also focused on finding systems of designs that I can then create variations in. But unlike Helena, I'm usually working on grid-based systems, on twist-based systems. And these different systems of designs that I find tend to be how to choose different tessellations based on the tiling and the symmetry type that you want. Another example of two tessellations in the same symmetry type are these two. And here there's a few more differences. In both of these, I have a central hexagon and a outer hexagon. Now this here doesn't look like a hexagon on this side, but if I flip it over, you can see these open hexagons out here. So the choices I'm making here are central hexagon, triangle, outer hexagon. So on this one, and really these two represent kind of opposite choices. Here I chose a closed hexagon for the center, an open triangle on the same side, and then an open hexagon on the back. Whereas here I chose an open hexagon for the center, opposite of closed, a closed triangle on the back side instead of open on the front, and then closed hexagon on the front instead of open hexagon on the back. So these are kind of end members of this expanded symmetry on the common hexagons and triangles tiling. So these two represent, like when I see these two, I see the same structure. And so with tessellations, there's the structure and then there are the choices within the structure. There are what is part of the repeating unit, and then there's the underlying truths of what would have to be part of any repeating unit. So in this case, I have those choices of central hexagon, triangle, and outer hexagon. And those three choices have to be made on any tessellation in this system. And I can then say, okay, I can draw a hexagon from center to center of these outer hexagons and just chunk that over to get my repeats. And likewise over here, if I draw a hexagon between my outer hexagons, I can just chunk that over to get my repeating pattern. And so these tessellations represent a hexagon type symmetry. And I'll be going more into these different symmetry types that we see on tessellations in the upcoming video series. We also have triangle type tessellations. And there's some interesting things going on. So if you recall back to the first tessellation I pointed out, I said this one had to be pre-creased and then collapsed. And that's mostly because these twists are going under each other. Well, this tessellation also has twists going under each other, but I was able to fold it twist by twist instead of pre-crease and collapse. So that's really my sweet spot of design, of being able to have these dense arrangements of twists, but still get the still be able to fold straight from the grid without extra pre-creasing. Like our Cinny Coomb, I also bring in some of these more unusual shapes like trapezoids, extra large rhombi, all kinds of stuff. And I found a variety of ways of arranging these twists that will let me make interesting patterns like this one, which is the same on both sides. Just fascinating to me. And I've also been working on discovering new ways of arranging common twists. So this is another way to arrange common triangles and rhombi, so you get these different kinds of effects. So that was a somewhat long answer to the question of what is an origami tessellation. And I hope that you now have a deeper understanding of what tessellations are and what the breadth of tessellations that exists out there is, and an idea of how to get started folding your own. So with that said, I'm going to sign off for today, and as always, happy folding.